Boston dressed itself in winter light the night Maya Collins slipped through the service entrance of the old theater, with her son's small hand locked inside hers. On the other side of the wall, the marble lobby glowed with wealth she was paid to never touch. Soft laughter drifted through velvet curtains like a world she once dreamed of and then lost. Evan's breathing was already uneven as the familiar tremor of panic climbed his chest and tangled the start of every word. Maya felt quiet, fear tightened behind her ribs as she guided him past coats and champagne trays toward the dim safety of backstage. She was scheduled to clear empty glasses, not to touch the piano that slept behind the curtain like a denied confession. Evan clutched at her sleeve, whispering through broken syllables that the noise was too much. His shoulders jerked as voices from the gala rose in sudden applause for some donor she would never meet. A stage manager cursed under his breath when Evan dropped to his knees, shaking beside a rack of costumes. Someone barked that she should make the boy stop, and Maya knew there was only one way. Veronica Hale's voice sliced through the curtain, demanding to know why a child was allowed near the hall at all. Her heels clicked like a verdict as security shifted uneasily behind her polished smile. Evan flinched, and the sound of his breath broke into a thin cry he could not force back. The curtain parted, and the light of the gala spilled over Maya and her son like judgment. Eyes turned in waves of curiosity and contempt as Veronica lifted a manicured hand toward Evan. A guard reached for the boy by instinct, and Evan's small body jerked as fear broke fully free. His cry cracked through the music and chatter of donors like glass shattering across marble. Maya moved between them on reflex, her hands shaking as she pulled Evan against her chest. Veronica's smile sharpened as she declared that this was not a place for disruptions or people without invitations. Laughter rippled nervously from the crowd, and the humiliation burned Maya's face hotter than any stage light. She felt Evan's sobs hitching against her collarbone and knew she was losing him to panic. Without asking permission, Maya turned toward the sleeping piano, her fingers already trembling with memory. Veronica scoffed that the girl was not entertainment and that the child should be removed at once. Maya did not look back as she settled Evan on a stool beside her and touched the first key. The sound rose, soft and bare, like a hand offered in darkness, and Evan's breathing stuttered into quiet. In the front row, Adrian Blackwood had been listening to nothing at all until that single note cut through him. His hand slackened, and the crystal glass slipped from his fingers and shattered at his feet. He did not feel the spill on his suit, as the melody unlocked a door he had sealed for 15 years. Each note matched the forbidden pattern he once heard in a hospital room, and swore he would forget. The room blurred as his pulse hammered, and the impossible familiarity of the song hollowed his chest. Veronica turned toward him, startled, as if the music itself had betrayed her control of the room. She snapped that security finish, the removal and restore order, as donors shifted in their seats. Adrian lifted his hand without rising, and his voice cut through the hall in a calm that frightened even him. He said stop, and the word moved faster than any command the guards had ever heard. Silence fell so abruptly that Maya could hear Evan's last trembling breath settle into quiet. Adrian finally looked at the woman at the piano, not as staff or scandal or inconvenience, but as the keeper of a wound he had never survived. Maya lifted her eyes to him for the briefest moment and saw terror there, not anger, and it shook her more than any insult. Around them the donors whispered the scandal, already transforming into rumor and headline as cameras drifted closer. Veronica recovered first and laughed thinly that a broken song could hardly halt a celebration of national defense and progress. The air held the weight of something irreparable as Maya's hands hovered above the keys, unsure whether she had just saved her son or opened a door she could never close again. Evan leaned into her side, whispering one broken word of thanks that only she could understand. The room paused. Finally. The orchestra pit seemed to shrink as every eye tracked the distance between the billionaire and woman at the piano and the terrified child beside her. That song is supposed to be impossible. Maya Collins had learned to survive in narrow increments of breath and time, long before she learned how to grieve. At 17, she was the quiet girl at the edge of rehearsal rooms, the one who stayed after lessons to practice until the janitor flicked the lights as a warning. Music had once been the map of her future, a clean and hopeful line she followed with disciplined trust. Lucas Reed had been the wildfire that crossed that map without asking permission. He was brilliance without caution, charm without breaks, and when he wrote melodies he did it as if the world owed him sound. Their love was not loud at first. It lived in shared headphones, late-night walks, and secret harmonies played under stairwells while the city slept. When Maya discovered she was pregnant, the shock came like winter through glass, sudden and merciless. Lucas held her face in both hands and promised they would find a way. 3 weeks later, he vanished. No goodbye, no explanation, no echo left behind. The police said nothing. His parents said less. The school whispered rumors that folded into silence. Maya waited for months, growing heavier with a life she did not yet know how to protect. When her family found out, the waiting ended. Her mother cried once and then shut every door with words sharper than knives. There was no space for shame in their house, only judgment, and it fell on Maya like a sentence. She left with a suitcase, a folded blanket, and a second-hand phone that never rang with Lucas' name. The strength she built after that came from exhaustion, not courage. She worked days at a grocery store and nights at a diner until her feet learned to ache without complaint. When Evan was born, she held him with hands that shook from fear and love in equal measure. The nurses spoke softly, and one placed a knit cap over his dark curls as Maya whispered that she was sorry for the world he was waking into. The early years were a blur of bus rides and borrowed cribs, daycare halls, and cold laundry rooms that smelled like bleach and defeat. Evan grew quickly as children do when survival is expected of them. At 5, he started to stutter under stress, the words tangling at the gate of his mouth when voices rose too sharply. Maya learned the rhythm of his panic before he did, and she learned the rhythm of her own shame when teachers looked at her with pity they tried to hide. Music returned to her like a ghost she could not quite banish. She found a cheap keyboard at a thrift store and practiced after Evan slept, her fingers stiff with rust and restraint. In the mornings, she taught beginner classes at a community center for small pay and large patience, and in the evenings, she waited tables or poured drinks for patrons who rarely remembered her face. The teaching kept her alive in a way the rest of her life could not. It reminded her that something in her still knew how to rise and fall with purpose. Boston was never kind, but it was steady. The streets changed with seasons, and Maya changed with them, always adjusting, always learning, where invisible lines of belonging were drawn. She never spoke Lucas' name aloud anymore, not even to herself. It lived instead, in the spaces between notes she avoided, and in the way she flinched when certain chords tried to form under her hands. Evan knew nothing of his father except that he had written a song for his mother a long time ago. To a child, that was magic enough. To Maya, it was a knife wrapped in velvet. The job at the theater came after a winter when the power went out twice in their apartment and the hot plate failed for good. A flyer near the bus stop promised steady hours and nights off from the diner. She took it without dreaming of the piano behind the curtain. The first time she passed it, she felt the air turn thin around her, but she kept walking with a tray in her hands like a shield. Backstage was a different world from the gala floors, silent and hardworking, stitched together by cables and timers and caffeine. She liked it there because talent was expected but anonymity was allowed. No one cared who she was, so long as the glasses were full and the hall kept breathing. Evan waited for her during shifts in a small room beside wardrobe with coloring books and headphones that were always a size too big. On good nights he slept through her work. On bad nights he panicked, and she learned to read the signs in his shoulders before his mouth could betray him. She lived in constant arithmetic, measuring risk against rent, counting quiet victories, like a teacher praising Evan, or a tip left folded tight in gratitude. The past learned to stay mostly where she put it, but sometimes it reached through her defenses in dreams, where she heard Lucas laugh without seeing his face. She woke from those dreams with her throat closed and her hands cold as if she had just touched snow. Hope was not something she trusted, but endurance she could manage. That was the shape of her life before the gala, a long, narrow corridor lit only by what she could carry. She did not know that the song she kept hidden had grown heavier than memory. She did not know that one night of terror for her son would unlock a door she had sealed with everything she had left. She did not know that survival and confrontation had finally chosen the same hour. Adrian Blackwood learned early that feeling was a liability dressed as weakness. He grew inside glass houses and silent cars, where everything was measured and nothing was named. His father taught him numbers before kindness and consequence before hope. At 14, he was sent to a private academy that produced leaders the way factories produce steel. That was where he met Lucas Reed. Lucas did not belong there, and made no effort to pretend that he did. He played the piano in unused classrooms, with doors open as if daring the world to interrupt him without permission or apology ever. Adrian was drawn to that defiance, like breath to flame. Lucas laughed easily and feared little, and when he spoke of music his eyes carried a certainty Adrian had never seen in himself. They became inseparable, with the speed only lonely boys know. At night they escaped into sound and story, and the future they imagined built itself out of reckless faith. Adrian loved him with a quiet intensity that frightened him more than betrayal ever could. He had been taught that affection was leverage, and he hid the truth even from himself. When his father discovered the relationship, it was not with rage but with calculation. Richard Blackwood studied Lucas, as if he were an equation that threatened an empire. Richard invited Lucas to a private luncheon that Adrian was not allowed to attend, and afterward, the world shifted without permission. Lawyers appeared with velvet voices and men in suits spoke of contracts and opportunities and responsibilities that outgrew a boy who only wanted to write music. Lucas returned pale and quiet and told Adrian nothing except that they had to be careful now. 2 weeks later, an accident was announced without details, and Lucas vanished from every place that had ever known his name. Adrian was told that grief was a private matter, and that memory was an indulgence he could not afford. He believed the lie because obedience had always paid him better than truth. He built the walls of his future with ruthless devotion, and let ambition replace whatever tenderness still lived in him. Years later, when he founded Blackwood Systems, he did it with a single purpose: never to be helpless again. The company grew inside government contracts and digital fortresses, and the kind of silence that followed money into rooms. He became admired and feared in neat, equal measure, while the boy who once waited outside rehearsal rooms for one more song learned to metabolize sorrow into control. Every relationship after Lucas failed because Adrian measured people by the exit they offered, not the warmth they promised. His father approved of that discipline and kept his influence close like a leash made of gold. When politics required a marriage, Veronica appeared with her practiced smile and bloodline advantages, and Adrian agreed because it was easier than remembering what refusal felt like. On the night of the gala, he had walked into the hall with the steady confidence of a man who believed nothing in the world could still surprise him. Then the piano spoke. The melody did not ask permission, and it did not care who he had become. It unfolded with the same coded tenderness he had once traced with his fingers in a hospital room when Lucas had been too weak to sit upright. Adrian felt the past strike him with physical force, and for one unguarded second the mask fell away. He saw the boy he had been, and the man he might have been, if fear had not chosen his path. The sound cut through 15 years of discipline, and reduced him to the raw astonishment of impossible recognition. In that instant, the power he wielded meant nothing, and the empire behind his name could not protect him from memory. The woman at the piano was not part of his world, and yet she held the one thing he had buried deeper than any secret. As she played, he understood that Lucas had not vanished from the world as cleanly as he had been told. Something in the logic of that melody refused to be a ghost. His breath shortened, and the room tilted, and it was all he could do to remain standing inside his own life. He followed the sound not with his feet but with the part of himself that had never been allowed to grieve. Each note confirmed what his instincts had already decided, that the song was both signature and confession, and only one man could have written it. The memory of Lucas appeared not as tragedy, but as living presence, and for the first time the idea that his first love might not be entirely lost felt possible and dangerous in equal measure. Adrian understood with cold clarity that if the truth stood behind that music, his father had not merely removed a boy from his life, but had rewritten history to preserve power. The gala returned in fragments of light and movement, and he realized that Veronica was speaking to him, and the crowd was waiting for him to respond to something he had not heard. He gave commands out of instinct, not strength, and watched as the machinery of his authority obeyed without question. Yet none of that machinery could still the tremor in his hands, or quiet the war inside his chest. The woman on the stage lifted her eyes for a single breath, and he saw no ambition there, only terror and resolve, and the fragile posture of someone who had already lost everything once. In that moment, Adrian Blackwood, the man, the brand, the idea ceased to exist, and there was only the boy who had watched Lucas walk into a meeting he would never return from. When the music ended, Adrian knew that time had shifted, and the life he had organized so carefully had developed a fracture it could not hide. He told himself that searching for the truth would destroy what he had built, and the thought brought him no peace, because part of him had already decided that destruction might be the only honest choice left. He remained in his seat long after the applause stumbled back into the room, and Veronica recovered her performance of gracious outrage. Every detail of the hall felt distant and unreal, as if the sound had displaced him from physical reality. He watched the woman help her child breathe, and understood with startling certainty that whatever lay behind that song would eventually claim both of their lives, whether he wanted it to or not. Adrian had spent years mastering the art of distance and the discipline of avoidance, and neither would save him now. The knowledge did not come as fear but as grim relief. For the first time since Lucas vanished, the path forward was not built from strategy but from truth, however violent it might prove to be. He did not yet know the cost that would be demanded of him, but he could already feel the currency being counted inside his chest: regret, loyalty, rage, and the last unspent portion of his heart that he had thought was gone forever. The gala resumed around him as if nothing fundamental had altered, but Adrian Blackwood understood something had fractured the story he told himself, and no amount of wealth or power would be able to repair it without first tearing it completely apart. The melody continued to echo long after the final note, and with it a single, impossible question took shape in his mind: whether Lucas had truly been lost, or whether he had been buried alive beneath a name and a world that no longer belonged to him. By the time the gala ended, the damage had already escaped the walls of the old theater and entered the bloodstream of the internet, where it would never fully die, because someone in the fourth row had recorded the moment Evan was dragged from his seat, and another had captured the instant Maya turned to shield him, and a third had filmed Adrian Blackwood frozen with a shattered glass at his feet. And within an hour, the clips were stitched together into a narrative that moved faster than truth ever could. By morning, the video lived everywhere, not as a story of a frightened child and a desperate mother, but as a spectacle framed for appetite and outrage, and the headline that rose first did not speak of humiliation, but of scandal, of a single undersighting mother breaking decorum at a national security charity and a billionaire losing control. And the question was not what had happened, but what she had wanted. Maya woke to buzzing on her phone that turned into a roar when she opened her messages and saw strangers dissecting her face, her posture, her child, as if they were characters in a show she did not consent to enter, and the words "gold digger" appeared so often it began to blur into static. By noon, the theater had placed her on administrative leave, using language that sounded sympathetic and cautious, while quietly removing her name from the next week's schedule, and by the afternoon a reporter waited outside the community center with a camera and a question she refused to hear. Veronica Hale understood the velocity of public judgment better than most, because she had been groomed inside it, and she moved with perfect timing as she always did, offering a carefully uncut version of concern to one outlet and a ruthless whisper to another that suggested manipulation and ambition in equal measure, leaving just enough room for doubt to bloom without ever placing herself in the frame. The rumor did not need any more oxygen than that, because the audience was already prepared to convict, and the comment threads filled with certainty as easily as lungs fill with smoke. Maya did not know any of this when she walked Evan to school that morning, with a scarf pulled too high, and her shoulders braced for impact, and when a classmate's parent pulled their daughter back, as if distance itself could disinfect rumored intent. Maya felt the old familiar drop in her stomach that said survival had once again changed shape. By the second day, the principal called her in with eyes that would not meet hers, and explained that, while the school believed in fairness, they also believed in calm environments for learning, and suggested it might be best if Evan took a few days away. Evan did not fully understand what was being said, but he felt the tension in the room, and the sudden way his hands began to sweat, and the stutter that had softened over the past year returned with sharp insistence as he tried to ask his mother if he had done something wrong. That question lodged inside Maya with the weight of a sentence she could not overturn, and she held him afterward in the car until his breathing finally slowed and the first tear soaked into the shoulder of her coat. Adrian watched the same footage she did, but from a distance carved by privilege and consequence, and the language around him was clinical and urgent, as advisors spoke in low voices about optics and political margins, and the perception of weakness in a year that tolerated none, while Veronica stood composed at his side with her hand on his forearm, in a gesture meant to be interpreted as loyalty. He heard none of it past the echo of Evan's cry and the collapse of Maya's face, as she reached for her son, and the deeper certainty that every word sold in his name would either widen or seal the fracture that had already split his life open. When he refused to issue a distancing statement, the room cooled in a way that carried threat beneath politeness, and when he declined the evening interview, the request became an expectation delivered as advice, and he learned very quickly how narrow autonomy could be when politics leaned into the senses frame. Maya tried not to look at her phone, and failed again and again because the world inside it was reorganizing her life without asking her where she wished to stand, and each message carried a new version of her that she did not recognize but could not escape. There were strangers who defended her with ferocity, and others who speculated with casual cruelty, and the worst part was that all of it lived beyond her reach, as if her own story had been lifted from her hands and passed through 1,000 uninvited mouths. By the third day, a donor withdrew funding from the community center, citing disruption and bad press, and the director called Maya into the office with hands that shook, despite decades of steady authority, and told her that sometimes protecting the mission meant making painful separations that were not moral judgments but practical ones, and she nodded because she had learned long ago how to accept words that pretended to be neutral. Evan packed his keyboard into its thin case that night, without being asked, and placed it beside the door, as if preparing for evacuation. And when Maya saw it, she felt the future narrow into a single line of immediate needs that left no room for the long horizon she once allowed herself to imagine. Adrian stood at the edge of his office, looking down at the city that had taught him how to harden his hands into tools, and wondered when exactly he had lost the ability to choose gentleness without paying an unspeakable price. His father called that evening with a voice stripped of warmth and heavy with disagreement that sounded almost like instruction, and he was reminded in precise language that scandals consumed innocent lives first, and powerful ones last, and that the proper course was not bravery but excision. Veronica did not argue with Richard Blackwood's logic, and did not need to, because her ambition aligned neatly with it, and she only asked Adrian to consider the consequences his hesitation might bring down upon a woman already standing at the edge of everything she could lose. That warning did not come as threat but as forecast, and for the first time he understood how easily prophecy could be engineered when resources bent in unison. Maya received the eviction notice the next morning not as a cold decree but as a polite letter explaining that leases were not moral instruments, and that renewal was at the discretion of the property owner who had suddenly discovered another use for the unit, and she stared at the paper until the variant words rearranged themselves into a future she could not plan fast enough to outrun. Evan found her sitting at the kitchen table with the notice folded between her hands, and asked if they were moving again with careful hope, as if change might still mean possibility, and she smiled because she had promised him long ago that they would never be afraid of starting over, even when fear stood directly in front of them. Across the city, Adrian read the first draft of a statement prepared on his behalf that expressed regret for an unfortunate disruption and reaffirmed confidence in institutional boundaries, and he recognized in its polished emptiness same machinery that had removed Lucas from his life with an efficiency that now felt obscene. He did not sign it, and the pause that followed tasted like the edge of war. By the end of the week, Maya owned almost nothing that did not fit into 2 suitcases, and a keyboard case, and a backpack Evan insisted on carrying himself, as if weight were a proof of worth, and the city that had never promised kindness watched her leave without noticing the absence it would not remember. The story online did not end with her departure because outrage rarely requires a subject once it has momentum, and her name continued to circle in rumor like a satellite that could not fall. Adrian attended meetings surrounded by men who spoke of exposure as if it were a disease, and of reputation as if it were an asset that could be insured and liquidated, and he realized that what they feared most was not the truth but the absence of a villain they could control. As days unspooled into a public theater of speculation, he felt his former self loosening inside the shell of obligation he had built, and he understood with an ache that the humiliation visited on Maya and her son was not collateral but a demonstration of how quickly ordinary lives could be erased when power grew impatient. When a junior analyst slid him a private message that showed coordinated posting patterns linking back to a firm connected to Veronica's family foundation, Adrian did not speak, but the knowledge settled in him like a verdict still awaiting its hour. That same night, Maya sat on the floor of an unfamiliar borrowed room, holding Evan as he trembled from the leftover echoes of a world that had turned on him without explanation, and she promised him that none of it defined who he was, though she could not yet see what shape their safety would take. Across the city, a billionaire stared at his reflection in glass and saw for the first time not a man in control, but a man surrounded by choices he had refused to make, and the distance between them felt at once unbridgeable and already closing with consequences neither of them fully understood. Adrian refused the driver and walked the last 6 blocks alone through streets that no longer felt like his. The night pressed close with the weight of unfinished questions, and he welcomed the anonymity it offered him for a few stolen minutes. He had found Maya through a trail of practical kindness, a school secretary who whispered a forwarding shelter address, a volunteer who slipped him a folded note with a location and a time written in careful block letters, as if discretion itself were a living thing. The room he entered was narrow and borrowed and clean in the way temporary places try to be. A single lamp warmed the far wall, where a thin curtain moved with the breath of the building. Evan slept on a mattress close to the floor, his fist curled around the strap of the keyboard case as if it were a lifeline. Maya stood when Adrian stepped inside, and for a moment neither spoke because the silence carried too many meanings to enter carelessly. She asked how he had found them, and he told the truth without detail, because detail would have required apology he did not yet deserve. He said he came because the song had not left him, and because he needed to hear where it came from in a voice that could not lie to him. Maya did not step back or forward. She simply sat on the edge of the chair, as if the space itself had decided where she belonged, and said that the song was older than scandal, and heavier than rumor, and that she had never played it in public before that night. She told him about the summer she met Lucas at a youth program run through the community center, when she was too young to know that brilliance could be a danger to itself. She described how he listened like a thief stealing silence, and how he wrote as if the world were burning at the edges, and music were the only way to save it. She said he wrote the melody late one evening after she told him she was afraid of becoming invisible in a life she had never chosen. She said he gave her the song without words because words would have been too exposed for a boy who already lived on the edge of leaving. Adrian felt the room contract around the truth he had come to hear, and he asked the question that had followed him since the glass shattered at his feet. He asked whether Lucas had shown the song to anyone else. Maya shook her head slowly and said that Lucas told her the pattern inside the melody carried something private, something he called a lock, that only 2 people would ever understand, and that she had never known what he meant until the night Adrian froze. The air shifted with the weight of a truth that neither of them could deny anymore. Adrian said that Lucas had brought the same melody to him once in a hospital room white with disinfectant, where the machines made a sound like a second pulse, and that Lucas had told him the song was a message he would never be able to say out loud. He said that in the days that followed, Lucas became quiet and watchful, in a way that felt like preparation, not fear, and that when the meeting with his father happened, everything ended without explanation. Maya listened without interrupting, and her hands lay still in her lap, as if motion itself were too heavy to risk. When he finished, she said that Lucas disappeared 3 weeks after she told him she was pregnant, and that she had searched for months for any word that he still existed, and found only doors that closed when she knocked. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the geometry of a past that finally aligned between them like 2 halves of a code sliding into place. Adrian realized that the song did not belong to loss alone but to connection, and that its survival through Maya had not been coincidence but intention. The melody was the thread Lucas used to tie 2 lives together, without letting either see the knot. He said that the pattern inside the music was also a cipher used in early audio encryption work, and that only Lucas would have had the audacity to hide it inside something as vulnerable as a love song. Maya felt the weight of the revelation settle into her as both gift and indictment. She had carried the song like a relic of private sorrow, and now it unfolded into a map of choices she had never known existed. Adrian asked if she still had the original pages, and she said that the paper had dissolved years ago, but the music lived entire in her hands, in the way the body remembers a fall long after the bruise is gone. Evan stirred in his sleep and murmured a fragment of a word that never quite reached sound. Maya rose to adjust the thin blanket over him, and when she returned, her eyes carried a new certainty that frightened her with its clarity. She said that if the song had meant something larger than either of them, then the night at the gala was not an accident but a summons, and that she had no interest in being a symbol anyone could use without her consent. Adrian answered that he did not come to ask her to carry the weight of his world, and that he would not hide behind her disruption as cover for his own war. He said that he believed Lucas was alive not as wish but as logic, and that the melody was the proof that someone had tried very hard to erase. The word alive landed between them with a force that bent the room around it. Maya felt the ground shift under a hope she had taught herself to distrust, and she gripped the edge of the chair, as if to steady a body that suddenly forgot how to be anchored. They stood there, facing the shared outline of a man who had shaped both their lives in secret, and the knowledge that they had loved the same heart in different ways did not divide them as both had feared. It bound them in grief that was suddenly shared and in responsibility that could no longer be deferred. Adrian told her that the cipher embedded in the song pointed to a closed set of research that had been classified through channels his father controlled, and that if Lucas had encoded truth into art, then someone had noticed. Maya asked what that meant for Lucas, and Adrian did not soften the answer when he said that it meant Lucas had likely been silenced for knowing too much in a world that preferred silence to reconciliation. The lamp flickered and steadied as if the room itself were listening. Maya felt the terror return, not as the old loneliness she knew but as a wider fear with sharper consequences. She said that she would not let Evan become an offering on the altar of any man's secrets, no matter how powerful, and Adrian did not disagree. He said that if she chose to walk away now, he would understand. The choice hung between them like a bridge only one of them had ever been taught how to cross. Maya looked at her son sleeping close to the floor, and at the instrument that had never betrayed her, and she made a decision that felt less like courage than inevitability. She said that she would not run from the song again, and that if Lucas had trusted the melody to lead where he could not, then she would not silence it now out of fear. Adrian nodded, because the truth in her answer demanded respect, and because for the first time someone had invited him into danger without offering him control. He reached for his phone and paused, then set it down as if the next move required hands, not mechanisms. The city outside continued its indifferent pulse, but inside the borrowed room, a geometry finally made sense. They had both loved Lucas, and they had both been abandoned by the same machinery, and the song had lived long enough to call them into the same hour. When Adrian left, he did not offer protection or promise or strategy. He offered only the truth that the melody had already forced into the open, and the certainty that whatever stood behind it would not retreat easily. Maya closed the door behind him and leaned into the wood until her breath slowed and the noise of the world found its distance again. She returned to Evan and watched the rise and fall of his chest, as if counting something essential back into the future. The song that should never have existed now stood between past and consequence, and for the first time since Lucas vanished, Maya acknowledged what the music had always been asking of her, not remembrance but response. Evan returned to school under the quiet arrangement of a temporary transfer negotiated by a social worker who believed in second chances more than policy, and by a billionaire who understood leverage even when he pretended not to use it. The new classroom smelled of pencil shavings and carpet cleaner and hope that had not yet learned fear, and Evan walked into it with his shoulders raised as if the ceiling might fall. The stutter returned in soft collisions at the back of his throat when the teacher asked his name, and Maya felt the familiar ache rise as she waited in the hallway, counting breaths with him through the closed door. Adrian had come only to drop them off and had planned to leave unseen, but Evan caught sight of him through the open office window and did something neither of them expected. He let go of Maya's hand and crossed the room on small determined feet and stood before Adrian with his chin lifted in a posture he had practiced in secret since the day he first watched the man freeze to a song meant for ghosts. The boy's voice shook but did not fail as he asked whether Adrian knew how to play the quiet parts of the piano, the ones that made people stop yelling. Adrian answered slowly, because the question demanded truth more than comfort. He said he used to. Evan nodded as if that were enough of a credential, and turned back to Maya with a look that asked permission without sound. She gave it without knowing why. 3 hours later, the call came that Evan had frozen during recess when older boys laughed at the way his words tripped and stumbled. The counselor described the scene with careful neutrality until Adrian arrived without announcement and without press, and found Evan hiding behind the portable music room that the school kept locked except for special sessions. Adrian did not kneel or lecture. He sat beside the boy on the cold concrete and asked about the sound the door made when it closed, because he remembered using detail as anchor when the world felt too loud. Evan whispered that the door sang in metal when it shut, and Adrian told him that meant it wanted to be heard. When the boys returned with their courage shaped like a dare, Adrian stood and asked whether they wanted to hear something the room had been keeping to itself. He requested the key from the custodian by name because he had bothered to learn it, and when the door opened, the piano inside looked like a treasure that had simply been waiting for an excuse to exist. Evan watched with wide, careful eyes as Adrian lifted the lid and pressed a single low note into the room. The sound did not accuse or impress. It only filled the space with proof of breath. The boys drifted closer without speaking, and Evan took his place beside Adrian and placed one hesitating finger on a white key that answered him without judgment. By the time the bell rang, the laughter had forgotten its purpose, and Evan had learned that noise could be rearranged into meaning if someone brave enough invited it. The afternoon unfolded in small returns of trust that looked to adults like trivial victories and felt to Evan like a border had shifted. He asked Adrian whether they could come back, and Adrian said they could come back as often as the room remembered them. Maya watched from the hallway, with her hands pressed to her mouth, and felt the shape of something she had not permitted herself to imagine take cautious form. That evening Evan asked whether Adrian would like to hear the quiet song his mother played when she was afraid, and Adrian said he would be honored. The shelter room filled with thin evening light that made the walls appear tender rather than temporary, and Maya's fingers moved over the keys with a restraint that had learned humility. Adrian listened not as a man seeking answers but as a witness invited into a truth that did not ask to be fixed. When the last note faded, Evan climbed into Adrian's lap without request, and the word that left his mouth surprised them both with its certainty. He called Adrian the one who plays like mommy, and Adrian felt the title settle where Armor had once lived. Later, when Maya tucked Evan into sleep, he asked whether everyone chose a family, or whether sometimes it grew by accident, and she answered that nothing important arrived without a mystery attached. Days gathered into a rhythm that did not pretend to be permanent, yet refused to be dismissed. Adrian appeared at the school when Evan hesitated to enter, and did not appear when Evan wanted to prove that courage could be summoned without surveillance. He learned to pace his presence the way one learns to pace language, when a child listens for harm in every syllable. Evan learned that if his words caught, they would be waited for. The stutter softened, not by cure but by dignity. One evening, as they walked through Public Garden with the city preparing itself for spring, Evan asked a question that had been traveling through him for weeks. He asked whether people could choose to protect someone, even if they had not promised to do it before. Adrian answered that choice was the only promise that mattered, and Evan considered this with the gravity of a judge. He stopped near the pond and looked at Adrian with a gaze too old for his face and said then, he chose Adrian. The sentence did not arrive with drama or ceremony. It was offered like a key placed in an open hand. Adrian did not accept it with tears or vows. He accepted it with the silence that knew how to hold weight without apology. Maya watched this exchange from the edge of the path, and felt the unease of hope press against her ribs as if asking for room. She had built her life on the premise that attachment was a risk she could no longer afford, yet here it was, asking to be named by a child who had learned survival too young, and had found safety in a man shaped by absence. That night Evan slept with the keyboard case beside his bed unzipped, and his small fingers resting on a silent key, as if to remind the future that permission had already been granted. Maya sat at the table and counted the ways the world could still betray them, and found that for the first time the arithmetic no longer balanced neatly in fear. Adrian stood outside the shelter in the dark, and listened to the sound of laughter he could not see, and understood that the strongest alliances are often forged without negotiation. The child had chosen him not because he was powerful but because he had listened when noise tried to become cruelty. The choice rearranged the map of Adrian's obligations in a way that strategy could not revise. From that night forward, whatever war waited behind the music would no longer belong to him alone, and for reasons he did not attempt to justify, he found that truth less terrifying than the loneliness he had carried in silence for most of his life. Adrian did not tell Maya where he was going when he left before dawn because the weight of the truth he sought was not something he could put into ordinary language without distorting it. He drove north beyond the edges of the city where glass and power thinned into trees and quiet roads, and the kind of silence that only private facilities can afford to buy. The address had come to him through a chain of careful favors and one unmarked file that passed through 3 hands without ever touching a server his father controlled. The facility did not announce itself with signs. It hid behind hedges and gates and a name that sounded like a retreat rather than a containment. Inside, the reception smelled of antiseptic and evergreen, and the woman at the desk spoke verification questions with a calm designed to make denial feel procedural rather than hostile. Adrian presented credentials that did not exist the week before, and watched the guard hesitate for a fraction of a second before protocol swallowed doubt. Dr. Samuel Moore met him in a narrow corridor, where sound fell flat against padded walls, and every clock seemed to disagree with itself. Moore was older than Adrian expected, with the posture of a man accustomed to carrying other people's storms inside his chest. He did not pretend surprise when Adrian spoke Lucas Reed's name. The doctor closed his eyes for a moment, as if to marshal a memory he had spent many years refusing to touch. He said that people were not erased all at once but in layers, and that Lucas had been silenced through a series of decisions that none of them were allowed to name as violence. He said Lucas had arrived 15 years ago under an emergency order tied to national security classification and a medical diagnosis designed to justify indefinite confinement where no public record could reach. He said the first months were chaos and sedation and refusal, and that the boy who had once written music like prophecy tried to scream until the walls learned his voice and stopped listening. Adrian felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, as if the corridor itself demanded discipline or ruin. Moore led him through locked doors, where windows were narrow and faces passed like weather behind thick glass. When they reached the room, Lucas sat near a window tracing invisible notes against the sunlight, as if continuing a phrase that had been interrupted in mid-breath 15 years earlier. The sound Adrian made was not a word but a broken thing that carried recognition more than language. Lucas turned slowly, as if the movement required courage he was no longer sure belonged to him. His eyes met Adrian's with a soft bewilderment that cut deeper than anger ever could. For a long moment neither moved because the space between them felt like water after a long fall. Adrian took one step and Lucas echoed it a second later, and the symmetry of the motion fractured Adrian's chest with memory so sharp it almost felt like relief. Dr. Moore spoke quietly and asked Lucas whether he remembered the song that meant the lock. Lucas lowered his head and his fingers moved with sudden urgency, as if sound had returned to his body before permission. He said he remembered everything and nothing, and that the remembering came in pulses as if his mind were a radio searching for a station it once knew by heart. He said the song was never meant to be evidence but goodbye, and that he hid truth inside it, because secrets traveled better when they pretended to be beauty. He said Richard Blackwood had understood this at once, and had called it dangerous creativity. The order that followed did not use the word prison, but the walls had learned to behave like one. Adrian listened as the past rearranged itself into a shape that could be named without myth. The encrypted work Lucas had done was not merely sound, but a system for embedding classified data inside tonal architecture, and his early breakthroughs had been absorbed into defense projects without his consent. When Lucas threatened to disclose misuse, he was converted from asset to liability in language that pretended neutrality, and vanished behind medical authority that spoke with government teeth. The diagnosis had been crafted by consultants who understood how easily dissent could be recast as instability when money demanded silence. As Lucas spoke, his hands shook with the effort to hold memory steady, and Adrian wanted to reach for him and could not yet move without shaking the world around them. Moore admitted that he had stayed because he believed presence was the only barrier he could raise against total erasure, and that each year he had watched Lucas become quieter and more compliant, not because he was healed, but because resistance had become too expensive for a body that remembered what freedom had once sounded like. Adrian asked what it would take to get him out, and Moore answered with a truth that did not whisper. He said it would take a public reckoning large enough to sever the contracts that named Lucas as classified anomaly rather than man, and that the machinery protecting those contracts would not loosen its grip without tearing something else wide open. Adrian saw then that the war he had avoided naming had been waiting for him long before Maya ever played the song. Lucas looked at him with the faintest smile, and said he knew the melody had found its way back into the world, because it no longer hurt as much to breathe. He asked about Maya without knowing her name, and when Adrian described the woman who carried the song, and the boy who had chosen a stranger as protector, Lucas closed his eyes and laughed with sound that staggered like a wounded bird trying, to remember flight. He said the child was braver than both of them had been at that age. When the visit ended, Lucas pressed a folded paper into Adrian's hand, with fingers that trembled from hunger more than fear. The page held a hand-drawn sequence of notes and numbers that Adrian recognized as a living key, the final architecture Lucas had built in secret, while the world called his mind unreliable. Moore said the key could unlock a series of buried files, and that if Adrian chose to use it, the consequences would reach far beyond personal recovery. Adrian answered without calculation that the only consequence that terrified him was leaving Lucas here to vanish by inches. On the drive back to the city, the sunlight felt unearned, and the weight in his pocket felt alive with threat and promise. He called Maya once and ended the attempt without allowing the phone to complete its work, because he could not yet bring this truth into a room where a child slept without first turning it into protection rather than peril. That night Lucas returned to the window after Adrian left and traced the shape of the melody against the glass, as if the sky itself were paper and he were not done writing yet. In the city, Maya lay awake with the echo of unsaid words pressing against her ribs, and the sense that the music had crossed a boundary it could not retreat from. The man who had been silenced had been found, and with him, the machinery that had tried to turn art into a weapon and love into liability. The war that followed would not wait for consensus. It would unfold on its own terms, with or without the consent of the lives already caught in its shadow. The first message came disguised as concern and arrived through a channel Adrian did not use. For conflict, a private assistant speaking with practiced softness about image management and the unexpected volatility of public sentiment, but, beneath the words, moved the clear outline of a warning that had already been approved before it was delivered. By the time he ended the call, the second message was already waiting in the form of a quiet summons from his father, not to argue but to observe, not to negotiate but to announce the limits of tolerance. Richard Blackwood did not ask whether Adrian intended to continue his involvement with Maya and Evan, because men who trade in leverage do not waste breath on questions the answer to which they have already purchased. He said that affection becomes a liability the moment it crosses into visibility, and that liabilities must be resolved before they attract consequence. Adrian heard what was not being said and felt the familiar tightening of a corridor he had spent his adult life learning how to walk without scraping his shoulders raw. That same morning Maya received a notice from the shelter that legal consultation had been requested regarding her recent movements and associations, and that until matters were clarified, the organization could not guarantee continued placement. The language was dry and procedural, and carried the kind of precision that lets cruelty pass for neutrality. She folded the paper and placed it beneath the keyboard case where Evan could not see it, and told him they were going to take a walk instead. By the afternoon, Veronica Hale delivered her own variation of the message, through channels designed to appear unconnected and therefore unaccountable. A distant relative who volunteered with a child advocacy nonprofit asked questions about Maya's background that were too specific to be casual, and a school administrator she had never met left a voicemail offering support that thinned rapidly into inquiry about past addresses and the presence or absence of paternal information on Evan's file. Maya felt the net tightening not as a single act but as a pattern that learned her shape and adjusted accordingly. When she finally reached Adrian by phone, his voice carried strain. He did not bother masking, and she told him that whatever game his world was playing, she would not allow Evan to become its currency. Adrian answered that the game had never required permission to begin, and that his refusal to participate did not change the rules by which it sought advantage. He said his father had threatened federal scrutiny under the pretext of national security, and that the threat was not empty because the channels behind it did not require merit to move an inquiry forward, only proximity to suspicion. Maya asked what that meant in plain language, and Adrian said it meant that love had become a liability in a system that prized silence above justice. That night, 2 unmarked vehicles sat half a block from the shelter and did not attempt concealment, because concealment implies doubt, and the men inside them needed none. By morning, the community center called to confirm that it had received notice of a formal investigation regarding unauthorized access to restricted areas during the gala, and that cooperation would require temporary suspension of Maya's teaching role, pending review. The director spoke with tears in her voice and apologized without conviction, because she did not yet understand that apology itself had been folded into the design. Evan felt the shift long before explanations reached language. His appetite dimmed and his hands found the edge of the table again during meals, as if preparing for flight, and the stutter returned in sharp fragments that surprised him with their own urgency. When he asked whether they were in trouble, Maya told him they were in change, and he pressed his face against her sweater and asked whether change had teeth. Adrian stood in his office, surrounded by evidence that no longer felt theoretical, and realized that the war now wore a face he could not pretend not to recognize. His father sent a final message with all tenderness removed, and said that the infrastructure keeping Lucas invisible was only one wing of a larger structure, and that if Adrian forced its collapse, the shock would find those nearest to him, before it ever touched Richard Blackwood himself. The meaning was clear enough to make breath hurt. By nightfall, Maya's job at the theater was formally terminated on the grounds of breach of contract and unprofessional conduct, despite her never having signed a contract that gave name to the rules now used to erase her. The eviction notice followed with adjusted dates on a letterhead that did not exist 2 hours earlier, and by the end of the day the keys to her life had begun to change in hands she could not see. Adrian arrived at the shelter without warning, and found Maya packing with mechanical calm, and Evan holding the backpack he had refused to stop carrying since the keyboard left their old apartment. When he tried to speak, she held up her hand and said that this time it was not going to be quiet, courage or endurance, or waiting that guided her next move. She said she was leaving Boston before the story learned how to swallow them whole, and that he was not to follow because the net around him was lethal at its edges. Adrian said that leaving only confirms suspicion, and that running from a fire does not extinguish it. Maya responded that she had done enough burning in place to know when ash is no longer soil. They stood in the narrow room with words colliding at the distance between conviction and care, and Evan watched them with wide, solemn eyes as if learning the posture of men who stand at the edge of rooms and decide whether to step forward or stand guard. When the door closed behind them, it did not carry drama with it, only a silence that felt newly earned. Adrian returned to his building and found that his access had been limited without announcement, not removed, but rearranged in ways that turned familiarity into negotiation. He realized that the perimeter of his own life had begun to answer to a logic that no longer regarded him as principal agent but as a variable to be solved. Maya and Evan moved through borrowed night toward a bus station that did not announce departures, as if discretion itself were now a civic virtue. Evan asked whether they were becoming invisible, and Maya answered that visibility is not the same as being seen, and that sometimes invisibility is how people survive until the world remembers them. As the bus pulled away from the curb, she did not look back, because she knew the act of turning would stitch the risk tighter around them. Across the city, Adrian opened the folded papers Lucas had given him and saw patterns that pointed not only to data, but to networks of intent that moved beneath the skin of institutions he had trusted by habit if not conviction. He saw that the architecture of silence had been designed to outlast any single act of defiance, and that what his father protected was not a secret but a practice. He also saw within the patterns the possibility of exposure that did not rely on confession but on demonstration, a proof that would require time and allies, and the willingness to stage vulnerability as public truth. The cost of such a choice arranged itself before him without apology. By morning, Maya and Evan were already somewhere between cities, their existence a line in motion rather than a location easily named. Adrian stood at the edge of a window that looked down on power, as if power were only distance described in glass, and understood that the people he had learned to command were now learning how to contain him. Love had become a liability because it had turned truth into leverage, and he would either have to surrender that love to preserve what remained of quiet, or risk everything he had inherited to earn what he had never been permitted to hold. The child had chosen him without threat. The world had now chosen its answer with precision, and neither choice could be reversed without consequence. The bus carried Maya and Evan through a corridor of sodium lights and half-sleeping neighborhoods, where houses leaned into one another like witnesses who had agreed not to speak. Evan pressed his forehead to the cold glass and counted the reflections of passing signs, as if each number were a step farther from the hands that had begun to close around their lives. Maya sat rigid beside him with one arm wrapped across his chest, not to restrain him but to prove that he was still here, that nothing had taken him yet. She kept her eyes forward, because the moment she allowed herself to look back, she knew she would see not streets but memory, and she did not trust memory to let her go. At the terminal, they moved with the practiced speed of people who had learned how to pack flight into the same motion as breath. No announcement spoke their destination out loud, and the ticket in Maya's pocket carried more future than certainty. A woman beside them spilled coffee and apologized too much, and Evan smiled at her with the politeness of a child who believes apology still matters. Maya watched that exchange and felt a sharp tenderness cut through her fear, because even now he was choosing gentleness without instruction. They boarded without names being called and found 2 seats near the back, where the engine vibration hummed through the floor, like a low note that refused to resolve. As the bus turned away from the station, Evan whispered that he felt like a secret, and Maya answered that secrets are just stories that have not found their right time yet. Hours folded into darkness and the city gave way to the kind of quiet that only highways know. Evan slept with his head against her ribs, and the keyboard strap looped over his wrist, as if even in dreams he feared being separated from sound. Maya counted breath and mile and the future she was carrying without a map. Somewhere in Boston, Adrian stood in a room that had once felt invincible and listened as absence rearranged the air. He tried to trace their route backward from the few gaps in surveillance he knew still existed, and realized how quickly the machine learned its own blind spots. When he reached the shelter, it had already learned new neutrality. The desk attendant quoted policy with kindness polished into distance, and told him that names were not shared for safety reasons that now extended in both directions. He left without argument, because argument would have intrigued the watchers who had already been assigned to measure his patience. He returned to his office and counted the cost of every move he had delayed making, and found that reluctance had multiplied the debt beyond easy repair. At dawn, Maya found herself in a town she had never planned to visit, and might not remain in long enough to remember. The bus emptied into a thin platform where wind tasted of metal and wet pine, and Evan woke, confused, and reached for her as if the world had rearranged itself too quickly to trust. A volunteer from a food bank recognized the look in her eyes, without needing to ask the shape of the question, and pointed them toward a community center that did not pretend to be more than it was. They slept that night on 2 thin cots under the low protection of a promise that no names would be shared without consent. The next morning, Maya sold the last of her extra clothes to a resale shop so Evan could have a sandwich that came wrapped in paper rather than apology. Across the same morning, Adrian sat at his desk and played the note sequence Lucas had drawn onto glass with his fingertip, until the pattern began to speak in a language his mind could finally translate into motion. The code opened not a single file but a corridor of references that pointed to procurement logs and medical contracts and classification tags, woven so tightly together that unthreading one would pull entire histories into light. He recognized the architecture of plausible denial, and saw how the song had been used as key and confession in equal measure. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that Lucas' confinement had never been about safety but about ownership, and that the machinery protecting that ownership would not pause because a boy had once loved another boy and written the truth into music. That evening, Maya found a quiet corner of the community center where an old upright piano leaned against a wall like a stray animal that still believed in shelter. Evan stood beside her as she touched the keys, and the sound that answered was thin and forgiving, and she felt her shoulders drop for the first time since the bus left Boston. She played without purpose or audience, and the room accepted the offering without condition. Evan sat on the bench and placed his hand on hers, and asked whether the song would find them again, and she said that songs have longer memories than people, and they come back when they are needed most. That same night, Adrian sent a secure message into a channel that had not been used in 7 years, and watched as a constellation of small green indicators returned acknowledgement one by one. Allies he had not yet named were listening. He typed a single sentence that carried no context, but all intention, and then shut down the terminal and waited. The message traveled outward without urgency, because urgency attracts counterweight. In the borrowed room where Maya and Evan slept, the silence was soft enough to rest inside, and Evan left her a gift without knowing it, when he slid the small recorder she had used to practice with into the pocket of her coat. In the quiet hours before dawn, the city received something else it did not recognize at first as danger. A data packet slipped through oversight like a fish through reeds, and arrived at a server that had spent years pretending it was not hungry. By morning, Adrian knew he had crossed a line that would rewrite the way his name was used in rooms where he would no longer be invited to speak. He stood by the window and watched the sun climb the edges of buildings that had never once asked who had paid for their foundations. Somewhere far from him, Maya woke with the certainty that running had no more distance left to offer, and that whatever safety came next would have to be built in place rather than found in motion. Evan listened to the town outside the center wake itself into sound and laughed when a dog barked at nothing, as if even now the world were practicing resilience. Adrian reached for his phone and hesitated, then played the audio file he had copied from the small recorder. At the moment, Evan's voice had been left behind without ceremony, in the space between their lives. The boy voice broke into the room with stumbling clarity, and spoke not to him but through him, as if the distance between them were already understudy for a future that refused to remain separate. "If I disappear, please keep playing for Mommy." The words cut deeper than threat, because they were not afraid, they were precise. Adrian closed his eyes, and the last uncomplicated part of him that still believed in clean outcomes finally gave way. The night she disappeared with her son did not erase her from the world. It moved her into the current of consequence, where motion itself becomes evidence and love learns how to survive without permission. Adrian Blackwood did not announce the war, because wars that declare themselves too early invite only spectacle, and the enemy his father had built thrived on spectacle more than truth. Instead, he began with silence and with patience and with a willingness to let the knife travel inward before it cut outward. He fed the decrypted patterns Lucas had given him into isolated systems that had no known bridge to his corporate network, and watched as dormant corridors of data lit up like old tunnels rediscovered beneath familiar streets. The first confirmations arrived as procurement trails that never should have intersected with medical authority yet did, and the second as classification tags that shifted names without changing the substance beneath them. He built a timeline, not of single crimes but of habits repeated with legal handwriting, and learned that what his father had taught him as discipline was in fact rehearsal. When he moved next, it was not toward public accusation but toward witnesses who had long ago learned that survival depended on forgetting. He found them through indirect channels: former compliance officers whose careers had ended in polite disgrace, a junior medic who had transferred continents overnight, and a systems engineer who still checked over his shoulder when ordering coffee. One by one they answered his questions with the tremor of people who had been waiting too long for someone to ask them correctly. The pattern that emerged was not dramatic in its individual acts but terrifying in its consistency. Silence had been purchased through severance and relocation, and through diagnoses that reclassified resistance as instability. By the time Adrian had assembled enough corroboration to form a skeleton of proof, he also understood that exposing it would not be a moment but a campaign, and that the cost would be measured not in stock but in names. He prepared by distributing duplicates of every file across 7 jurisdictions that did not trust one another enough to coordinate their own erasure, and by contracting legal counsel, whose loyalty was indexed to principle rather than platform. When he finally made the approach to the Department of Justice, it was not through a public tip line but through a sealed meeting with professionals trained to detect performance. He entered the room without entourage, and with evidence arranged not to persuade, but to endure scrutiny. The first agent who read the summary did not speak for 2 minutes, and when she did, she asked only whether Adrian understood what he was doing to his own life. He answered that he had understood that for 15 years, and had simply chosen the wrong direction in which to walk. Parallel to the federal intake, he delivered a separate package to regulators who governed the securities architecture that had funded the shadows he was now tracing into light. Those investigators moved with less ceremony and more hunger, because money leaves cleaner footprints than fear. By nightfall, his father knew that something irreversible had begun, not because anyone had told him, but because certain silencers in his world stopped answering their cues. Richard Blackwood summoned Adrian not as a father calls a son but as a strategist invites a rival to observe the board. The office where they met had not changed since Adrian's childhood, and that continuity felt suddenly obscene. Richard spoke first and did not raise his voice because men who raise their voice advertise the thinness of their leverage. He said that Adrian had mistaken sentiment for principle, and that the world would correct that misunderstanding with efficient cruelty. Adrian waited because waiting had once been his shield and now it was his scalpel. He told Richard that the evidence had already been separated from his control, and that any attempt to erase it would only confirm intent. Richard studied him with the interest one reserves not for enemies but for failed predictions, and said that truth does not move evenly, and that it crushes the nearest before it ever reaches the highest balcony. Adrian answered that he had already seen the nearest crushed, and that the view from the balcony no longer impressed him. Richard introduced contingency through implication, and spoke of investigations that could find their way into any life that traveled too close to treason disguised as conscience. Adrian placed a single document on the desk, and said that contingency had already begun to inform itself. Richard glanced at the page, and for the first time in years his eyes sharpened with something that resembled surprise. He did not read the rest, and that restraint told Adrian everything. The war moved next into daylight not as accusation but as inquiry, crawling across committee schedules and sealed motions across courts that did not sleep. Reporters sensed the change in tone before they found the material, and began to circle with questions sharpened into permission. Adrian refused all interviews and let the documents speak in sequence, rather than in chorus. The first leak was not sensational, and that was its power. It revealed procurement irregularities that no single signature owned, yet every signature shared. The markets did not crash at once because markets resist narrative more than they resist loss, but valuation began to tremble, and board members began to count exits rather than dividends. Richard adjusted by offering partial scapegoats, with careers designed for sacrifice, and for a moment the machine appeared to absorb the shock. Then, the medical contracts surfaced, and could no longer be recast as collateral practice, because the names beneath them were alive and prepared to testify. Dr. Moore appeared before a closed committee, not as whistleblower but as witness, and described Lucas' confinement not with outrage but with clinical precision that made denial sound childish. When Adrian authorized the next release, he did it knowing it would wound him publicly and permanently. The song cipher was revealed not as art but as proof of hidden work, and proof is the currency that does not devalue with repetition. By the time Richard moved to preemptively divest from several subsidiaries, the pattern was already visible, and regulators do not stop hunting when prey sheds a layer of skin. The day federal agents entered a building bearing the Blackwood name Adrian was in a quiet town sitting across from Maya in a borrowed kitchen, where the kettle sang thinly and Evan traced circles on the table with a pencil as if mapping his own private geography of waiting. Adrian had not told Maya the scale of what he had set in motion, because scale is a burden best delivered by outcome rather than promise. He told her only that the doors behind Lucas had begun to loosen and that men who had traded in silence were now being asked to speak under oath. Maya listened with the kind of attention that comes from someone who has learned to measure sincerity by the way a voice handles uncertainty. She did not ask what it would cost him because she had seen enough cost accounted for in advance to know what the ledger required. That afternoon, Evan asked whether they were still running, and Adrian answered with truth that surprised him by sounding like hope. He said they were no longer running from the same thing. By evening, news broke not as scandal but as process, and the headlines resisted melodrama in favor of accumulation. Investigations were confirmed without names, and commentators speculated without knowing how close the truth already stood to public sight. Richard released a statement declaring confidence in due process, and stepping back from daily operations with the composure of a man who still believed distance could insulate. Adrian read it without reaction and forwarded it to his counsel with a note that said, simply timeline preserved. The war did not climax with guns or sirens but with calendars and filings, and the patient work of people whose vocation was to keep silence from being the last word. In the days that followed, Lucas was moved under protective jurisdiction, from the facility that had named him anomaly back into the world that remembered him as man. Adrian did not witness the transfer. He waited, because waiting no longer felt like retreat. When he finally received confirmation that Lucas was safe enough to breathe without supervision, the weight inside his chest shifted not into relief but into readiness. The war against his own blood did not require hatred, because hatred collapses too easily into spectacle, and spectacle feeds the structures he was dismantling. What it required was fidelity to a truth that had waited 15 years for the patience and the positioning to become undeniable. In the quiet town where Maya and Evan slept, the world did not shake with the news yet, but the change moved beneath them like an approaching tide that carries no sound until it reaches the shore. Adrian stood at the window and watched the sky rebuild itself into evening, and understood that victory would not look like vindication, but like a passage made safe enough for breath to pass through without memorizing the shape of fear. The town did not appear on any map that mattered to power, and that was precisely why it held the kind of quiet that lets a life stitch itself back together without witnesses. Adrian arrived just after dusk, when the sky still carried a thin line of fading gold, and the streetlights had not yet decided whether they were necessary. He walked the last block without the driver, and without the phone in his hand, because some thresholds require the body to arrive unmediated. Maya opened the door before he knocked, as if the house itself had learned the rhythm of his steps, and called him forward without speech. For a moment, they simply stood there listening to the sound of Evan laughing somewhere in the back of the house, and the familiarity of that sound rearranged Adrian's chest more gently than any victory could have. He told her that Lucas was out not free in the language of movies but free enough to feel air without permission and to sleep without listening for keys. Maya closed her eyes and let the sentence move through her as if it were a bridge built of breath. She did not cry because tears had learned exhaustion in her body, and what came instead was a trembling stillness that felt like a held note waiting for resolution. Evan ran into the room when he sensed the change, and stopped short when he saw Adrian standing there, as if he were the last piece of a picture someone had finally turned right side up. The boy approached with the care of someone who had learned that joy must be tested before it is trusted, and placed his hand into Adrian's without question or rehearsal. That simple contact did more to steady Adrian than all the confirmations he had received from courts and committees combined. They drove together without hurry to the small clinic, where Lucas had been placed under transitional care. The building was unspectacular, and that was its mercy. No gates announced authority, and no signs declared secrets. Inside the corridor, the sound of a piano drifted faintly from a room at the far end, like a pulse that refused to be contained. Adrian felt his breath shorten, not with fear but with the memory of sound returning to flesh. Dr. Moore met them near the doorway with eyes that carried both relief and the careful caution of a man who had learned not to speak too brightly too soon. He led them into the room where Lucas sat at the instrument with a posture that no longer braced for interruption. The light across his face was pale and honest, and when he looked up and saw Adrian, he did not startle or withdraw. He smiled with a softness that seemed to come from an older place than pain. Maya stood still because movement would have felt like intrusion, and Evan stepped forward because children recognize invitations that adults still negotiate. Lucas watched the boy approach, and something in his hands steadied as if the future had offered him a measure he could finally keep. Evan lifted his eyes and said that his mother had played a song that made storms in a room stop shouting, and Lucas looked at Maya then, and the understanding between them passed without language. He touched the first chord and Evan answered with the next, without instruction, and the sound that formed was no longer the relic of a past encoded in survival, but the beginning of something that chose to speak forward. Adrian did not move closer, because closeness in that moment belonged to gentler hands. Lucas played not to demonstrate but to remember, and the tremor in the melody resolved naturally as the room learned to breathe without surveillance. When the final note fell into the wide quiet that followed, Maya found that she was smiling without being able to trace when the movement began. Lucas turned to Adrian then and said the words that had waited 15 years for a safe room in which to land. He said he was sorry for leaving without goodbye, and that silence had been forced upon him before he learned how to protect others from it. Adrian answered that he had learned to mistake survival for obedience, and that they had both been rearranged by forces that pretended inevitability. The space between them no longer asked for explanation because it had been filled with music that insisted on continuity without erasure. Lucas looked at Maya with a gaze that carried both farewell and gratitude, and asked how the song had survived. She told him it had done what all living things do when no one is watching. It adapted. Evan climbed onto the piano bench with permission shaped like instinct, and Lucas guided his hands into the simplest pattern that creates a promise of harmony when repeated with patience. Adrian watched the boy move with a confidence born not of talent but of acceptance, and felt the word family rise without needing to be debated. Later, outside the clinic, Lucas asked to walk alone for a few minutes, and when he returned, his decision was already settled into the calm of someone who has waited long enough to know what belongs to him and what does not. He told Adrian that the space he had once held in both their lives now carried a different purpose, and that love is not measured by what it keeps, but by what it releases at the right hour. He said the melody belonged to Maya and Evan now, because it had chosen their hands as the place where it would grow rather than withdraw. Adrian did not argue because he recognized in Lucas' choice the exact courage he had once loved, and now finally understood. When they left the clinic, the air felt lighter, not because the past had been resolved but because it had been granted motion. Over the next weeks, the town learned their shapes without asking for backstories, and the quiet routines of repair began to replace the vigilant choreography of hiding. Evan attended school without looking over his shoulder, and when his words caught his classmates waited instead of rushing. Maya accepted a temporary position teaching music at the town center, where the piano keys were chipped and stubborn and faithful. Adrian did not return to Boston, but neither did he abandon the work that still needed his presence to move forward. He learned the habits of a smaller sky and discovered that power travels differently when it is not permitted to perform itself. One evening, as the sun dissolved into the fields behind the center, Maya finished her lesson early and found Adrian waiting by the doorway with a folded piece of paper in his hand. He told her that Lucas had left it for her before entering a different recovery path that would take him farther than either of them could follow for a while yet. The paper held a melody unlike any she had ever seen from his hand. It began where the old song had once ended, not in loss but in a series of rising turns that refused to resolve into anything smaller than light. Lucas had named it without ceremony, the second melody. When Maya played it for the first time, Evan stood beside her and Adrian listened from the threshold of a life that no longer required permission to belong. The music did not speak of goodbye or reunion but of passage of hands into hands and rooms into rooms without erasure. After the last note faded, Evan looked up and said the song felt like running without being chased, and the simplicity of his words undid the last defensive knot inside both their chests. It was weeks later when Evan first called Adrian Dad without rehearsal or announcement, while they were building a crooked tower of wooden blocks on the floor, and Maya heard the word not as claim but as invitation, and found that she was not afraid of it. That night, Adrian asked Maya for no promise except the smallest one that keeps a life honest. He asked whether she would continue to choose him even when the quiet failed, and the work returned with noise and risk. She answered that she had chosen him the night he stood still for a child he did not know, and that the rest had simply become language for what that stillness had already declared. The second melody carried them not as escape but as anchor into a future that did not require forgetting in order to be built. 3 years later, the town no longer referred to the renovated brick building at the edge of the river as the Old Mill, because names change when purpose changes, and the sign above the door now read Riverlight Music House in softly painted letters that caught the afternoon sun without needing to announce themselves. Inside, the air always carried sound, not loud but layered, with children practicing scales, adults relearning courage through imperfect rhythm, and the low, disciplined patience of teachers who believe that beauty is built through repetition rather than revelation. Maya moved through the rooms with the ease of someone who had stopped measuring every step as defense and begun to trust the ground again. Her hands carried chalk and sheet music, and the ordinary authority of a woman who no longer needed permission to lead. Adrian arrived most afternoons without ceremony, sometimes in the same quiet shirt he had worn for years and sometimes still stiff with the residue of rooms where power lingered too long. The war he had started did not end with a single verdict, but with many small decisions that accumulated into consequence. Richard Blackwood resigned from political boards and settled into a retirement that bore the mark of courts rather than choice, and the accusations that once moved like rumor learned the language of record. Blackwood Systems divested from defense contracts in a sequence that the market treated as anomaly, and Adrian treated as necessary exhale. The company that remained focused on educational infrastructure and encryption for civil institutions, not because the work lacked danger but because it no longer required someone else to be hidden for it to succeed. Lucas did not return to the town except once near the end of the first year, when he stood in the back of the recital hall with Dr. Moore beside him, and listened as Evan and 6 other children played the second melody with the unguarded seriousness that only the young bring to creation. He left before the applause because belonging for him had learned to travel in lighter forms, and wrote to Maya afterward that the music no longer hurt to hear, and that sometimes that was the surest proof of healing. Evan changed quietly, the way children do when fear no longer claims every doorway. The stutter did not disappear, but it became a companion rather than a cage, and his classmates learned the pace of his words, as if they were part of the rhythm of the room rather than a disruption. On weekends he climbed onto the piano bench beside Maya, and played with the concentrated delight of someone who understood that skill is not owned but practiced, and that mistakes are simply places where the next note learns how to be brave. Adrian built shelves in the back room with imperfect corners, and learned to accept instruction from a boy who took carpentry as seriously as music. They laughed together more often than they spoke about the past, and when memories arrived, they were received as teachers rather than judges. The town learned Adrian's name in pieces, first as a volunteer who fixed wiring, and then as a donor who did not ask for plaques, and finally as the man who stood in the rain during the annual summer concert, holding an umbrella over a woman who conducted a choir of children whose hands shook with first performances and pride. Maya learned that her life no longer required contingency as its central language, and that trust did not appear all at once, but arrived in increments that could be counted and honored. The day Evan performed the original melody with full orchestration arranged by one of her students, grown older into a composer, she stood at the back of the hall with Adrian, and wept without hiding because nothing in the room asked her to explain why. When the final note rose and resolved into a silence that held rather than swallowed sound, Evan lifted his eyes to where they stood and smiled with the unguarded entitlement of a child who expects to be met with love, and found it waiting, without effort. That evening, as the chairs were stacked and the last lights dimmed, Adrian took Maya's hand and led her to the small stage where the piano still waited, with the patience of a witness that had seen more than it told. He did not kneel with spectacle, and did not speak with rhetoric shaped for rooms that traded in attention. He only asked whether she would continue choosing to make a life together, not because it was healed but because it was honest. She answered with a quiet yes that carried all the years between running and risking, and he placed a simple ring on her finger without explanation, because explanation would have reduced the magnitude of what had already been said. Evan watched with his head tipped to one side as if measuring whether the world had shifted the way it often did in books, and then announced that he would play the song for them now, because this was clearly a moment that required music. The notes that followed did not strive for grandeur and did not need to. They carried the confidence of a future that no longer relied on rescue as its central plot. The seasons continued their unremarkable cycle outside the walls of Riverlight, and the town learned to expect sound as a kind of weather that arrived daily and asked nothing in return. Adrian traveled when the work called him, and returned with the steady reliability of someone who no longer mistook distance for power. Maya expanded the program with scholarship support that came not from a foundation bearing any one name, but from a ledger of small donors whose contributions added up to a refusal to believe that art belonged only to those who could afford to fail at it safely. On the anniversary of the gala that had once torn the surface of their lives apart, they held a quiet concert not to commemorate scandal, but to celebrate the ordinary miracle of continuity. Evan played first and did not stumble once, not because fear had been vanquished but because it had lost its authority as arbiter. Afterward, Lucas sent a message through Dr. Moore containing only 4 words, and a handwritten measure at the corner of the page: keep choosing the next note. That night, after the doors were locked and the last chairs stacked, Maya and Adrian sat at the piano in the dim room, while rain traced patient lines on the windows, and she played the first melody slowly, as if greeting an old companion who had learned better manners with time. When she finished, Adrian added the second melody without announcement, and the 2 lines braided into a sound that did not erase struggle but folded it into something that could be carried. Evan fell asleep on the bench between them, with his head on their joined hands, as if he had always known exactly where the center of the world belonged. Outside, the river moved with the indifferent persistence of water, and inside, the 3 of them listened to the quiet that no longer felt like absence but like rest. They had not chosen the world that had tried to consume them, but they had chosen the music that answered it, and the choice did not require witness to remain true. If this story touched you even in one quiet place inside your chest, I want to hear from you, because stories like this live longer when they are shared, not just watched. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and what moments stayed with you the longest. The night of the song, the child choosing his protector, the truth buried for 15 years, or the second melody that gave them all a future. Your words matter more than you think, because every comment helps this channel reach someone else who might need this kind of hope tonight. If you believe that love can survive silence, loss, power, and fear, then tap the like button so this story can travel farther than we ever could alone. And if you want to keep walking through these kinds of stories with us, stories about broken people choosing to heal through courage, family, and quiet love, then subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. I read your comments every day, and many of our future stories are born directly from what you share. So if you have a theme, you are longing for a single-parent story, a second-chance love, a hidden past reunion, or a quiet healing ending, write it below. This channel exists because of you, because people still believe that music can carry truth, that children can change adults, and that even the most powerful hearts can still learn how to be gentle again. If you watched this story all the way to the end, type the word music in the comments, so I know you are part of the family that stays for the full journey. And if you are watching late at night alone, I want you to know you are not invisible here. Your presence counts, your heartbeat counts, your dream counts. Until the next story, keep choosing the next note even when life feels out of tune.